Hey everyone, it's Joe from greenlightsound.com, and in today's episode, we've got a look at the new Neve 1084 preamp and EQ from Universal Audio. And this is the EQ from a Neve 80 series console from the 70s. There's a Class A preamp plus EQ that gives it some more options than the classic Neve 1073 EQ. If you have supported UAD hardware with Unison technology, you can track through the plugin and add the preamp character and EQ on the way in as well. The preamp is the same as the 1073's preamp, but includes 3 switchable EQ bands and a narrow or wide Q setting or bandwidth setting. It was actually introduced shortly after the 1073 by Neve as kind of an upsell option, a more fully featured option than the 1073 EQ was. UAD's emulation models the entire circuit, including the dual-stage Class A red knob preamp, the EQ filters, of course, the fader itself, and the post-fader output amplifier. The EQ's filter interactions and internal clipping behaviors are also modeled. There are a total of 10 different areas of this circuit that can clip, so you can get a lot of cool saturation and distortion out of this tool. Just a quick overview of the controls, which are pretty simple. First of all, we've got the preamp section itself, the red knob preamp, that adjusts the gain for both the mic pre and the line input, depending on what side you're on here, line being on this side, the mic pre section on the other side. It's got sort of an unusual negative numbering system that's based upon the sensitivity of equipment rather than gain. You could also send a line level signal through this thing through the mic input, which then can be used for distortion effects and get it to really get nasty sounding distortion, which is nice. The 3-band EQ section has a high shelf, which has selectable 10, 12, and 16K filters. This outer knob here is where you switch between the different settings of the filters. The inner knob has plus or minus about 20 dB of gain, positive on the left, negative on the right. The mid band has selectable Q setting here. You can see this high Q in or out, so you can narrow that bandwidth a bit. Again, the outer knob for selectable frequencies from 350 Hertz all the way up to 7.2K. This one also has about plus or minus 20 dB of gain. Then you've got your low shelf, which is a 35, 60, 110, or 220 Hertz filter, and that one gives you about plus or minus 15 dB of gain. And of course, we've got our high cut and low cut filters included as well. This mic Z or impedance switch on top here, when you set it to low, the mic impedance is 300 ohms. On high, the impedance depends on the gain setting. It's 1.2 thousand ohms with the gain between negative 20 and negative 50, and 600 ohms when the gain is between negative 55 and negative 80. So all depending on what you're setting here as the preamp on the preamp side will affect what your impedance is on this side. And switching this has a subtle effect on the signal color and response, not a really major effect. Most studios would just leave it up in the high position here because in the actual original hardware, to change it to the low mic Z setting or low impedance setting, you'd have to crawl under the console and flip it that way. So it's usually just left on high. You've got a 20 dB pad. If you've got a really hot signal coming in, you want a pad before it hits the preamp section. Of course, you got a phase button down here, which I neglected to mention. You've got the output fader, which is modeled. This is a clean digital output, nothing modeled here. The power switch, of course. We've got our EQ in and out button down here as well. When it's highlighted like that, darker, it's engaged. When it's out, you still get some coloration because the signal is still passing through that modeled virtual circuitry. So that's our basic overview of the controls. So let's get right into hearing this thing in action. And we're going to start with a kick drum. The mix I have going on right here has nothing going on in it at all processing-wise. Just a really rough balance, some pan and fader movements. That's it. It is going through my typical mix bus processing here, affecting the overall signal, but no individual channels have any processing going on. So the only thing we're going to do here is add the EQ that we can get out of this Neve 1084. Here's the kick drum part with the EQ bypassed. So now we're going to start changing some of these EQ settings. Engage the EQ first. Here we go. So what I basically did there is drive the input a little bit harder to get some of that saturation from the preamp, and I used the fader to bring it back to about even before processing. I cut off a little bit of the bottom end, anything below 45 hertz was cut off, and a little bit of the top end, anything above 18K. A little boost at 60 hertz, cutting some of that frequency at 700 just to get some of that mid-range mud out of the kick drum part. And at 10K, I put a little bit of top shelf on there to get some snappiness out of the beater of the kick drum. And one thing about these Neve EQs that's really helpful, I mean, some people might think that they're sort of limiting in that you only have certain fixed frequencies to choose from, but they're really well thought out and well chosen frequencies. The low band, for example, you've got your 60 hertz for that kick drum, that's sub at 35, the 110 and 220 if you want to add some body to a snare drum, for example, or bring out some of that meat in a bass guitar, they're perfect for that stuff. The mid-range frequencies are great for adding some bite in the upper mid-range or cutting out some of that low-mid mud. Of course, you got your high shelf at 10, 12, and 18, covering everything you need at the top end. So they're really well chosen. Next thing we're going to do is take a look at it on snare drum. Here's the snare part with no EQ engaged. So now we'll do the same thing. We'll go through the process of using this EQ. It's definitely a subtle difference. I drove the EQ a bit to get some saturation, a little bit of top end, a little bit of mid-range bite, and that body at 220 added along with some high and low cut. Pushing that preamp again, I brought the fader down to compensate for it. These digital recreations of analog style EQs like this are often really well paired with a good clean digital EQ, something like the stock EQ you have. PreSonus has its own stock EQ, or like a FabFilter Pro Q style EQ to kind of do some cuts, some really narrow cuts in there as well. But just for plain boosting, these are really great. Next, we are going to move on to bass guitar. Here's the bass guitar part by itself without any processing. Get the idea, and now we'll engage the processing. I really wanted to drive it hard that time to get some of that nice saturation and crunch out of it. Here it is bypassed again. And engaged. Some really nice saturation there. Now let's see if we can really drive it incredibly hard with this mic input. Imagine running that in parallel as some parallel distortion, really low level with the main bass part. I mean, that would sound great. We will go to a guitar part next. Here's a guitar without the processing. And we'll process. Another thing you can do if you run out of frequencies here, if you've boosted or used all three and you want to do something else with this, is just stack another instance on top. So I'm going to put another instance of the Neve on this guitar part, engage the EQ, and I'm going to cut out a little bit of that upper mid around 3.2, I think. I think I'd like to bring a little bit more of that top end and mid range out, do those a bit. Here it is without any processing. And with the 2 instances of the Neve 1084. Definitely more aggressive on the top end, and that would really help it cut through a mix nicely. On its own, it sounds a little bit too much, but in the context of a mix, it could really help it cut through. And the final source we're going to hear this on is going to be a lead vocal part. So here's the vocal without any processing.
And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slipping.
So what I'd like to do here is add some of the saturation again to see what this sounds like being pushed really hard and clipping.
And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slipping.
You can really hear how much more body is added to the signal. Here it is without.
And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slipping.
And now with that saturation.
And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slipping.
That's a really nice saturation. Now let's add some of this EQ as well.
And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slipping. And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slipping. Through my hands. And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slipping.
And here it is again without.
And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slip.
And with.
And through my hands, yeah, I can feel you slipping. Through my hands.
Well, there it is, the UAD Neve 1084 preamp and EQ. If you're looking for an analog modeled equalizer that has some great saturation, really nice classic EQ options, and just a great sound overall, this could be one to check out if you've got any UAD hardware. If you've got any questions or comments, let me know in the comment section down below. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already so we can keep you in the loop as to what's coming up next. And I will see you in the next one.